r/asked Reddit lawyers of Reddit, what was your oh shit moment in court? I'm no lawyer, but this one still makes my dad's friend laugh and one of his favorite stories to share. So my dad's friend was a sheriff for the local county. I was in the military deployed overseas. While I was gone, I guess I got a jury notice at my dad's place. I don't show. Warrant is placed for my arrest. Sheriff calls my dad and goes, hey, you do know your son has a warrant out for his arrest, right? My dad freaks. Sheriff goes, let me look into it. He finds out why I have the warrant. Sheriff goes to the ADA in charge of cases like this. Dude is a giant asshole and requests my warrant is dropped due to me being overseas. ADA pretty much tells him to fuck off and that I had better show up to court on the date he wants. So Sheriff and my dad reach out to my command. Command gets a hold of me. I call and find out what's going on. Sheriff has a plan to make the ADA look like a moron in front of the judge, who I know due to playing little league football with his son. So my court date comes. Judge calls my name. My dad approaches and asks permission to be there in my stead. Judge looks at my dad but goes, okay. My dad explains how I couldn't be there or avoid jury duty on purpose due to being deployed to Afghanistan. Judge is smirking. ADA is demanding proof. So in comes the sheriff with a laptop attached to a TV. I had skeeved and talked to the judge. Just as the judge is about to drop my warrant, ADA pipes up, how do we know he even is overseas in a war zone, eh? Funnily enough, right around then some Taliban guys decided to try and mortar the base I was on. You hear the siren, the call to take cover. Of course I had to go, but according to my dad the ADA sits down and barely mumbles, please drop the warrant. So I'm not a lawyer. But I recently had to go to court. I was extremely nervous, first time, and I was getting fucked by my plaintiff. Focused on the judge, I always answered, yes your honor, no your honor. My lawyer looks at me to ask a question and I look him dead in the eyes and say, yes your honor. I go silent for a second and say, sorry I meant yes ma'am sir, and just sat back down. I think the judge found this funny because I got off pretty well. Obligatory not a lawyer, but I watched this happen in the courtroom. Let's call the defendant Mr. G and the victim Mr. B. Mr. B showed up to a truck stop in full drag after the two had met online and then they had consensual sex. Get ready for a roller coaster. The defendant testimony is this: Mr. B left in a hurry, but he noticed that his wallet was missing. He went out to confront Mr. B, who said he needed to be paid for his services. Payment was never discussed beforehand. Mr. G demands his wallet back. Mr. B pulls a knife and stabs it at Mr. G, but misses. Mr. G punches Mr. B because Mr. B was in drag, including heels. He was easy to knock over with that single hit. Mr. G grabs the knife, stabs Mr. B in the neck, then 21 more times all over the body. He then flees to North Carolina to meet with family. He flees again to New York to escape the authorities, but was caught and sent back to Tennessee, where he awaited trial for 2 years. In court, the defense called a witness to testify to Mr. B's aggressiveness to show that Mr. G was really just acting in self-defense. During the direct examination, he casually mentions Mr. B being roughly 5'11". It had been previously mentioned that Mr. B was tilde 5'7". When the prosecution cross-examined him, they asked if he saw Mr. B in court that day. Well, yes. He's that guy in the yellow sweater over there. Points to Mr. G. This also opened the door for the prosecution to call character witnesses who all testified to either Mr. B's peacefulness or Mr. G's aggressiveness. Mr. G was convicted of second-degree murder. Juror on a murder case 2016. Investigating detective was asked by defense if decedent had a street name in an attempt to establish a rough reputation. Yes mom. Defense attorney, and what was that name? Asterisk detective glances in direction of jury box with a look that strongly cautions us to not react. It was all nuts, ma'am. I looked to the ceiling while biting my tongue to keep from laughing because the deceased's family was in the second row. The stenographer chimes in to request a clarification. Is all nuts spelled as it sounds? Detective, no ma'am, it's nuts with Z-O. Shia. One of my first trials as a prosecutor was a theft case involving employees of a metal recycling plant who had stolen a spool of copper. The other two co-defendants had been convicted, so I didn't imagine having any issue winning the trial. The manager of the plant, who only spoke Spanish for some reason, was my star witness. Talking to him through the interpreter, I just assumed he was on board with the prosecution. He takes the stand and we go through some basic questions, and at some point the interpreter says he's a good person. It was those other guys. I don't think he did anything wrong. No coming back from that, but I delivered my closing like a champ. Not guilty in 5 minutes. I observed a criminal hearing while interning in law school. From the moment the case was called, the defendant behaved like he was the smartest guy in the room. I can't remember if he had counsel or not, but he was absolutely the type to represent himself. As the prosecutor described the details of the defendant's prior offenses, the defendant gleefully jumped in to correct the narrative, all with that tree again, sweet-eye brand of condescension. Prosecutor, the defendant was convicted of indecency with a child aged 14 or younger. Defendant, she wasn't 14. She was 10. Like spiking the football after an interception, but the football is more years in prison. Then, later, prosecutor, the defendant was also charged with having explicit sexual phone conversations with the victim. Defendant, man, I ain't never talked to her like that. It was her little sister. I think one of the other interns had to leave the courtroom at that point. Potential defendants of Reddit, please take note, even if you were not this dumb of an ass, you were as likely to talk yourself into more jail time as out of it. Hire a lawyer. I'm late to this party, but whatever. I was watching an eviction trial before my matter, where the landlord was claiming significant damages because the tenant had created an 8x8 garden plot on the rear deck of his apartment, 3rd floor, and a 3-decker, the weight of which had allegedly caused the deck to pull away from the building. Landlord is on the stand and is asked something by the tenant's attorney concerning the plot. And he goes on to very carefully avoid saying the guy was illegally growing weed while describing perfectly a green leafy plant that he didn't recognize. There had clearly been a motion in Lemine preventing the landlord from testifying that the guy was growing pot. It was a jury trial. By the looks on their faces, all the jurors got it. Surprise, surprise, verdict for the landlord. I wouldn't hit my wife. I only get violent when I smoke crack. I had to ask, did you smoke crack the day? Well, honestly, yes. Ooh, another good one. During jury selection, DA used his strikes on the only 2 African-American jurors. We raised Boykin, which says that prosecutors can't strike individuals based on race. He'd struck the only 2 black jurors, which gave us concerns. So, we go back in chambers, and the judge orders him to provide those reasons for striking. Now, 99 times out of 100, the DA provides race-neutral reasons that sound plausible enough that the judge is going to affirm his strikes and life moves on. This was not that day. He explains the first one fine. Guy had a criminal history and had been prosecuted by the DA previously, although never convicted of a felony. Figured that might bias him. Then he gets to the second, an older lady, and says, "Judge, I didn't even pay attention to the fact that she was black, I was just trying to get rid of women." The judge and both myself and co-counsel just stare. Later cases, following Boykin, have made gender-based strikes equally illegal, and Guy just admitted to doing it. Ultimately, the trial went forward, but was later overturned for the blatant misconduct. Family law attorney here. One of my colleagues was representing a mother defending against father's proposed relocation of their child out of state. During cross-examination, it came out that mom has another kid whom she abandoned a few years back by just up and moving across the country. Client had never even mentioned the existence of this child before, let alone the highly prejudicial circumstances of her departure. Late to the party, but I'll post it anyway. Nail, but a court reporter for the local paper. It was a manslaughter trial. One guy is accused of killing his longtime neighbor. It's about mid-trial, and the victim's son is called as a witness by the prosecution. A couple questions in, we get this exchange. Prosecutor, do you know the defendant? Witness, yes. Prosecutor, how do you know the defendant? Witness, he killed my father. Gasps and objections all around. This is a story told by trial advocacy professor my 3L year. He was representing the state/prison against a man who claimed that he was not given proper care/accommodations due to his back issues. The guy was pro-SC, representing himself, and at one of the initial proceedings, my professor admitted that he walked in there very confident, as anyone who represents themselves as a fool for a client, so to speak. He became disconcerted when the fellow seemed to be rather savvy, referring to himself as the plaintiff, making a few good points, etc. Then the good part happened. The man had his wife on the stand, and he was direct examining her. Isn't it true that the plaintiff had been suffering for quite some time with back problems? Well, I'm not sure. Isn't it true that the plaintiff had been suffering with back pain for years while you have known him? I can't really exactly. You know goddamn well my back has been giving me problems. And that's when my professor smiled and took his W. I was representing a woman in an abuse/neglect matter, and in order to get her kids back, she was required to go to drug court, I think weekly. So we were in drug court that week, which is like basically being in AA, but with a judge and also drug testing, and she's tested positive that week for cocaine. The judge starts laying into her, don't you want your kids back? You've been clean for 6 weeks, blah blah. So she decides that the best lie is to tell the judge that, no, she didn't take cocaine, but she let some guy nut in her that did, and that must be why she tested positive. Science. Obviously, he didn't buy it, and she had to start getting clean all over. Here's a story I heard from a retired judge. Years ago in Finland, a 17 teen had used a fake ID to get alcohol and was caught. She was a month or 2 away from being able to legally buy alcohol. This was at a time when Finland had no specific law against using fake IDs for situations like that, but it was obviously illegal, and the law that crimes like this fell under was falsifying government documents. For reasons unknown, rather than the police just taking the fake ID and telling the kid to grow up, they actually charged her with the crime, so she went to court. Her entire family was there watching as the 3 judges. Finnish system is very different from the one in USA. No jury of peers, for example, were reading out the charges. Judge mentions that the minimum punishment for this crime is 1 year in jail, and that it cannot be turned into fines. They pause to ask the girl if she had already found out if she can arrange to take the national school exams in prison, and that due to the severity of the charges they need an hour to decide on their ruling. Once the courtroom has been cleared of everyone, the judges go to a nearby restaurant to have lunch. When they come back, the judge starts reading the sentence and mentions that as there is no way to give a punishment lesser than 1 year in jail, they have chosen to instead disregard the charges entirely, which is a thing that they can do. Judges start packing their stuff while everyone in the girl's family sits silently, not really understanding what happened. Finally, her grandmother walks up to the judge and asks what happened, and the judge just tells her that the girl isn't in trouble, but she better not do it again. Then the judge mentioned that these days a crime like that would be a €50 fine, and nothing more, and that sometimes he had given out 2-3 punishments for disrespecting the court to the defendant even before they have finished reading all the crimes they are suspected of, because some hooligans can't behave for 5 minutes. Thanks for listening and getting this far. I hope you all enjoyed it. Remember to like and subscribe if you enjoyed.